Okay, I think we're ready to go. Again, so our first speaker, I'm very happy to introduce Bonnie Harper-Lore. Many of you have probably heard of her. She was a very active and has been a champion for habitat in particularly roadside rights-of-way for many years. She's a retired restoration ecologist who worked at the Federal Highway Administration as their vegetation resource for all 50 DOTs. She found roadside solutions via research funding, policy writing, and technical information sharing. She served on 3 White House task forces and authored 3 vegetation management handbooks. So again, very much a subject matter expert on overcoming obstacles in roadsides. Welcome, Bonnie.
Not much of a podium person, so hope this will work for you. Also, when I talk with my hands, you'll see this, which will be pretty interesting too. Want to see if I can back it up. Okay. Okay, I come from what I call the most Bray Generation. This was how the county road I lived on was maintained by horse-drawn mowers. They were really friendly people, by the way. They'd stop in our front yard and have lunch under our tree. But things have changed. I want to share with you a quick story. When I was a kid, I got really excited about, well, I lived on a farm and Dad was kind of chauvinistic. He really didn't let me get out and sling bales and drive the tractor, which were things I wanted to do. So my aunt gave me a set of golden books about trees, flowers, birds, etc. And so every summer, instead of working, I was off hiking the hills and the valleys of western Wisconsin, discovering all these exciting things. I don't know, how many of you took Sunday afternoon drives when you were a kid? Any of you old enough to have done that? Oh, good. I'm not the only one. We were driving after having dinner at Grandma's house, after church in the morning, having dinner at Grandma's house. We're driving down the road, and I've got my face glued to the back window because I'm looking for wildflowers. Because by then, they were pretty important to me, and I saw this butterfly weed, this orange butterfly weed, and I'd seen it in the book, but I'd never seen it in any place. And I said, "Dad, stop, stop," and he just kept on driving. And until this voice out of the back seat, my grandma's voice, his mother's voice, said, "Oh, Lynn, let her stop." And I jumped out of the car into a roadside ditch and picked my first butterfly weed. I later learned that I wasn't supposed to pick them, but at that time we were all picking them. So, and the thing is, I have 2 daughters of my own, and when we've driven up and down the roads over the years, never once have they asked me to stop to see a flower, because by the time they were growing up, they'd all been mowed and sprayed out of existence. It's because of that I've done what I do. Well, I'm actually retired. I don't do it anymore, but it's hard being retired, so thanks for inviting me. What I want you to know, I'm going here to give you the highway side of things, what I've learned over 20 years of working with highway departments. But remember that highway rights-of-ways are often shared rights-of-ways. This is my front yard in Minnesota. That right-of-way is shared with fiber optic lines, cable lines, sewer and water lines, electrical lines, phone lines. We don't have any oil and gas pipelines or rail lines. Those are the only 2 we don't have in our front yard. But we do have these shared rights-of-ways, and I guess that became really apparent to me when I attended a conference back in 1996 where utilities, railroads, etc. all came together and talked about how we had vegetation management issues in common. So this is the highway system. The blue lines, of course, are the interstates, the red lines, the state highways. What I want to make perfectly clear here, so there's no doubt, that your federal gas taxes go, I know you have no idea. They go to the Federal Highway Administration, and then those are divvied out to each state for projects and upgrades. And once the project is constructed, the Federal Highway Administration steps back and says, okay, state of Illinois, whatever state you're in, you take care of it. We helped build it, but you have to maintain it. And that leads to some issues we're going to be talking about. The constraints, the obstacles, and best management practices that I have seen along this corridor. By the way, if you add up all of those corridors that are federally funded, it adds up to 17 million acres, what I call 17 million acres of opportunity. Some of the constraints. First of all, how many of you ever worked with, in or with highway departments? Okay, this is good, friendly crowd. And you can correct me if you think I'm wrong in anything that I'm about to say, but this is my experience. The people that work in departments of transportation are pretty adverse to change. They have learned over time to follow the rules, the regulations, and that's the way they do business, and it's worked very well for them. They're not good at information sharing. I hope that's improving. But in the past, I was always told, Bonnie, do not go to conferences and tell them what's not working in Minnesota. It was like I would be embarrassing them if I told them what wasn't working. But I said, how else do we learn if we're not telling about what works and what doesn't work? Then there is a lack of knowledge, at least at the district level. Every state is divided into districts or regions within the highway department, and they are staffed differently. They don't each have a vegetation person at all, someone who knows a native plant from an invasive plant. So that leads to some of those decisions that they make. Then when they're doing construction, the EPA requires permitting that requires quick cover on highway projects. At least within the first 2 weeks, there has to be something green and growing to follow Clean Water Act rules. So that's always a constraint. It's hard to get things growing in 2 weeks. And then there's the front lawn of America. There was actually a book named Roadsides, the Front Lawn of America. It's written in 1936 by a Michigan engineer who within the book actually goes on to say that we should take our cues from what is growing alongside our rights of ways, see what's growing there that does well, and use those things on our highway rights of ways. But it was the title of the book that caught on, not his words of wisdom. And we've been mowing lawns ever since, or yards, front yards, yes. We've been mowing highway rights of ways ever since. And I want you to know right up in front that there is no regulation that requires any Department of Transportation in this country to mow from right-of-way fence to right-of-way fence. That is each state or each district's decision. It is not the law. Some of the obstacles. Well, so I come along in 1980s actually in Minnesota, suggesting that we plant native wildflowers and grasses. Well, first of all, there are all kinds of things wrong with having chosen wildflowers. Should have used the word native plants from the very beginning, because wildflowers were considered kind of a bunch of fluff, something superfluous. You know, why would we invest our money that way? And then there were all those people out there on those mowers that looked at what I was suggesting and said, hey, it's just a bunch of weeds. And it's because they were plants that they had grown up with. Many of them had grown up on farms and had seen these plants, but they were in the way of a corn row or on the side of a soybean field, and they just thought, those are just a bunch of weeds. So we had that to overcome. Then, of course, seed supply was not big 20 years ago. It's better now, but it's still not good enough. So that remains an obstacle. And in the beginning, there were no rules or standards that they could look to guide them in terms of how do we plant native grasses and forbs or flowers. So change doesn't come easily within departments of transportation. It's been my experience the only way change happens is if there's a new regulation, a new rule that they have to follow, or they get new funding. To me, that's the only way change happens, unless there's an internal champion within your state. Some states have had some of those champions along the way. So best management practices that have been happening, we'll start there, with highway departments across the country. You will see that some of them are digging into their toolbox and actually doing prescribed burns. This is a picture of Caltran. I think they're a little overdressed for the job, but it is the safe way to be dressed for the job. Of course, many states are now using biocontrols to get rid of invasives like leafy spurge and knapweed. Grazing's being used successfully in some states, believe it or not. The one tool I never thought we'd be able to get into a highway right-of-way for safety reasons, but there are safe ways of doing it and sites that are really appropriate for doing it. Planting natives, also catching on across the country, I'm happy to say. We've also invested some money in coming up with equipment cleaning innovations that we will actually clean the undercarriage of a truck, a mower, construction equipment. When we put out the RFP, we asked for someone to come up with a cleaning device that would clean equipment before it moved from one site to another, which often carries weed seed from one place to another, and come up with something that's affordable. I think this equipment is somewhere around $50,000. Still not affordable enough to have in every district in every state. So I want to talk to you about native plants for a minute because pollinators prefer grassland habitat. Highway engineers should prefer grassland habitat too, because if there are no trees on that right-of-way, their liability plummets, and that is very important to the whole transportation system. So if your car needs a soft landing when it goes off the road, landing in grassland plants is where you would prefer to be. But instead of planting them, if we don't have enough seed source, we don't have enough funding to do it, how else can we accomplish that kind of roadside? Well, it turns out that there are lots of highways in this country that were built long ago, not the modern interstate, of course, but before the interstates, that have remnant grasslands already on them. The first example is in Florida. That is a grassland in Florida. Florida has prairies, by the way. Different states call their prairies different things, so that's why I've fallen to using the term grassland, which kind of encompasses all of them. But every state has some kind of grassland. The top, California, actually we're huddled around a small, very rare, just lost the term, it's a wetland plant community, vernal pool, that we found on their highway rights-of-way near Chico. Turns out, this shows you what a small amount of money investment can do. I offered California because they claim to be a really environmental state. Only I didn't think they were necessarily paying attention to their roadsides. So I said, I'll give you $15,000, a small grant, back in 1994, if you can find one native plant community on your roadsides. Just one. They came back to me with 19. I'm sure they could have found more. but 19 that they now protect as biological management areas to this day. This happened to be one of them. We were looking at a tiny little flower called foam flower, which was endangered, and underneath it there were fairy shrimp that were endangered, just happily living on a roadside. Who would have thought? And I think if we looked for more of those remnants, we would find that those remnants also serve as great pollinator habitat. So the bottom corner, Minnesota remnant, happens to be wedged between Highway 52 and an old railroad bed. I don't know, the lights are really bright, so I don't know if you can really tell. Is there something we can do about the lights? Great. But the color that you will see is kind of a rosy bronze color. In the fall of the year, you're driving down the road, you see this bronze color, you know you're seeing a remnant prairie. It's an easy way to spot them. And anyway, it's wedged between the two highways, and that remnant has been protected in Minnesota for a very long time. Part of the reason, of course, is the railroads would have accidental burns, which favored those grasslands persisting along that right-of-way. So native plantings have been happening since the 1970s, actually. In 1973, the Federated Garden Clubs of America worked with the Federal Highway Administration to establish something they called Operation Wildflower. And it meant that they would provide the seed if the Department of Transportation would provide the labor. And that relationship lasted quite a while, but it didn't work out well in the end because they weren't always selecting the right seed for the right soil and water conditions. And the Highway Department itself didn't have the right equipment to put the seed in the ground, the drills or the broadcasters that normally deliver native seeds. Those seeds aren't as easy to plant as a soybean seed or corn seed. So, a good example is Nebraska. Nebraska has been doing it, well, they've been doing it long before the 70s, actually. And we could talk a long time about Nebraska. We just finished and posted a book on the Federal Highway Administration website called Vegetation Management, an Eco-Regional Approach, and it's an appropriate book for anybody who's managing rights-of-ways. When we've written books, we didn't do them just for highways, we did them for all land managers. And it tells the Nebraska approach. Nebraska is using specific seed mixes for different parts of its state. You might think Nebraska looks all alike. It has a lot of diversity. And so they're very carefully matching seed to site and having a great deal of success. Missouri has a long history of using native plants, as does Colorado. And you see they look very different from one another. You can't plant the same seed mix from coast to coast. It won't work. And I'm afraid that's something that the whole pollinator movement is kind of pushing towards. They are so eager to get, and I'm part of it too, we're so eager to get plants out there that pollinators will use that I'm afraid we're going to plant a lot of things that are going to have consequences in the future. So be very careful if you're planting what you plant in the first place. Be sure it belongs in that particular state, in that particular region. So when it comes to best management practices, for years highway departments have reduced spraying, probably not enough. There are states like Utah. This is inside of a Utah DOT cab to show you the kind of technical information that they're now able to use on the fly when they are spraying. So they're aware of all of the weather conditions, and they record everything they do, what they're spraying, at what rate, at what location. Keeping those kinds of records very important, and also allowing them to reduce even further the amount of spraying that they're doing. Reduced mowing. I saw on the guest list that there's at least one person or more from Pheasants Forever. Where are you? Thank you. Thanks, guys, because it's because of Pheasants Forever that in 1985 the legislature in Minnesota passed a Reduced Mowing Act. And it was for the purpose of protecting pheasants that were nesting in highway rights-of-ways. When you're whizzing down the road 65, 55, 75 miles an hour, there's a lot you might not see going on in those highway rights-of-ways, including nesting of birds, migrating birds, and others, pheasants being one of them. And to me, it's this reduced mowing law that we need in every state in the United States. It means that they don't mow right-of-way fence to right-of-way fence anymore. They mow one swath along the edge of the pavement, one swath enough for a vehicle to pull off if they need to. This only applies to rural highways, so everything outside of the city limits throughout each state no longer mows right-of-way fence to right-of-way fence. I will tell you, I now live in the Minneapolis area. They're not even mowing within the city limits, which I find a little odd, but they've carried it even further into the city, the idea of mowing less, and I'm sure pollinators will benefit because of it. They are allowed once a year to mow from right-of-way fence to right-of-way fence, and that is the month of August. And they kind of consider that cleanup before winter comes. I've suggested over and over again that they probably shouldn't do it because, first of all, pollinators can still be within those rights-of-ways, but secondly, if they leave the vegetation in the rights-of-ways, they'd be surprised how much snow, blowing snow, that those grasses and plants would hold for them and reduce their mowing. And by the way, when you reduce mowing, it's free. It's free habitat. We don't have to invest any money at all. I was asked by the White House Task Force, you know, what do you think, what are some quick things we could do? And I said, stop mowing. That's the easiest way to get habitat for pollinators back on highway rights-of-ways. So how change happens, I already alluded to this, that policy or regs have to change, funding has to happen, but now we have public pressure. We're having public pressure from the pollinators side, and I think it's a good thing because it's going to help us do those best management practices that we've not been doing all the time. So if anything moves the use of native plants and the control of invasive plants more than in the past, it will be the public and the public support that you get. It will be good public relations for all of us, if we can be that crass, to show that the public that we aren't the guys in the black hats all of the time, that we can indeed do some things that are environmentally supportive. And within each Department of Transportation around the country, I found champions, and that's another way that change happens. But champions come and go. They move along. Wanted to show you this Wisconsin rest area had this marvelous native planting. It was not only a pleasant way of stopping at this rest area, but it showed how well these things can grow. Unfortunately, you all have, Wisconsin has a different governor now, and he sold this building, and it's been moved to some commercial use. I hope other departments of transportation aren't experiencing that kind of loss, because our rest areas do us a lot of good in terms of public relations. I don't know about you, but I depend on them when I'm traveling across the country. So how do regulations and funding change? Well, in 1987, I was invited with 4 other state departments of transportation to visit Lady Bird Johnson, and she said, what are the obstacles to planting more wildflowers? Why aren't you guys able to do more? Well, we told her, of course, that funding was part of it, and by the end of the year, she had a senator in her pocket who put an amendment on the transportation bill that required native wildflowers be planted, but only 1/4 of 1% of the landscape budget, which on lots of projects turned out not to be very much, maybe $1,000 here, $2,000 there, not enough. So we have worked hard over time to increase that number, but to no avail. And in 2005, we thought, okay, another transportation bill came through. What can we do that will at least help on the invasive plant side? And we made a new eligibility for those federal funds I told you come to each state. Now, when they come to your State Department of Transportation, the commissioner and staff sit down and decide where this money is going to go. And it normally goes to new projects, pavement, and bridge repairs. All important. But that's where all of it goes. Since 2005, okay, that's 11 years now, controlling invasive plants or weeds, noxious weeds, and planting native plants also has had the right to have a piece of that pie. Very few states have taken advantage of that. There's still that possibility, and I think with public pressure, they will start using that opportunity to put more money into invasives. I, by the way, used the kudzu picture to show you that remind me and you that we are up against some really huge invasive plant issues. I know kudzu already exists in Illinois. I know it's in Iowa. Believe me, Minnesota's watching its borders. Kudzu is not one of those plants you want to let in. I see some nods of people knowing what I'm talking about. And we all thought that it wouldn't be cold hardy. Plants keep adapting, people. They don't just remain their same old personalities over time. They do change, and this plant, kudzu, is now cold tolerant. So how I really got, although I had funded some research while I was working for the Department of Transportation, it wasn't until 2 years ago that I became politically involved with the pollinator issue. I got a call from the leader of a group called Make Way for Monarchs, and he said, Bonnie, we'd like you on our coalition. And I said, I'm sorry, Paul. I'm just not a one issue kind of person. I'm just one species at a time. I just don't do that. And he said, well, think it over. And so I got thinking it over and I thought, well, okay, if we help move monarchs forward, then other species will also benefit. So I signed on. Next thing I knew, they sent a letter signed by all of us to President Obama, which was really cool because President Obama was headed for Mexico for a visit with President Nieto and then Prime Minister Harper from Canada. They have these annual summits. I don't know if you knew about them. I didn't know about them. But the three leaders get together every year to discuss what the new issues are and what they should be working on together. And that year, they decided that monarchs would be something they would work on. And President Obama came back promising to protect monarch migration in the United States. Came back and he put together a White House task force, which thankfully included the United States Department of Transportation and Federal Highway Administration. So they had a seat at the table to say what they could and couldn't do to help monarch migration. By 2015, he had expanded it to the Pollinator Health Task Force and has since come out with recommendations and the three main goals of reducing honeybee colony losses, protecting monarch populations, and restoring 7 million acres of habitat across the country that will suit all pollinators. So these are things that are going on federal lands and will indeed help pollinators. the only reason I'm here today is because Jennifer Hopwood from the Xerces Society asked me to take her place because she couldn't make it. The Xerces Society was on that task force, okay, so they were a big part of information input. Also, the Federal Highway Administration decided they really needed to have a kind of status report of what was going on in all 50 states, who was doing what, who needed what. And the Xerces Society did what they called a literature review, which was really interviewing all of the states and finding out what their obstacles were to doing more with pollinators. So in 2016, the Federal Highway Administration posted the results of that study named Pollinators and Roadsides, Best Management Practices for Managers and Decision Makers. And once again, although it's for roadsides, I am telling you all land managers will learn something from it. If nothing else, how to work with roadsides that are adjacent to the land that you manage. So there's also a contact name. Deidre Remley is the person who now watches over native plant issues and invasive plant issues. And you can just Google pollinators and roadsides. It will come up, or go to www.environment.fhwa.dot.gov. So this is what I call information sharing. This is important to all of us in the room. And the President's Science and Technology Office was able to work with the Department of Transportation before their new Reauthorization Act. Transportation only gets a Reauthorization Act or a bill through Congress about every 7, 8, 9 years, okay? This one was long overdue. This is 2015, the last one was 2005, okay? But finally, Congress was able to move this one through. It's called the FAST Act. I just lost the acronym. Fixing America's Surface Transportation is what it stands for. Anyway, it has provisions in it. We now have in black and white, codified in highway regulation. It's the law that we have to encourage. This is the loophole word, encourage, but it's in there. It could only be encouraged because we couldn't provide any new funding. Encourage pollinator habitat and forage on transportation rights-of-ways, including more integrated vegetation management, which I claim most DOTs are already doing. Reduced mowing. Since then, the Transportation Research Board, which is kind of the science oversight of all highway departments, has held webinars on reduced mowing, trying to get the idea out there to all the states, and increased native plantings. So all of these words now are in the law, so transportation decision makers can no longer ignore them. Another thing that came out of the President's visit and his White House task force is something we're now calling the Monarch Highway. Back in 1993, I got a letter from a group of people in Oklahoma who said we would really like to work together on a partnership to plant native plants from Minnesota to Mexico. So we met with them and we started funding their efforts. The 6-state partnership called themselves Prairie Passage. They all shared the same logo and they all shared information with one another and started planting more natives along the I-35 corridor. Well, when the White House Task Force heard about that group, they said, well, and you can see that I-35 goes through what is our historic tallgrass prairie area, the green on the map. So it's a natural for planting native grasses and flowers. Anyway, the task force decided, oh, we'll use that 6-state partnership to establish the Monarch Highway. So not everybody agreed that we should change the name, she says. But it's now called the Monarch Highway. It has funding about $20 million. I think they can do something with that. And just about a month ago, I was scanning the internet and saw a list of 100 examples of President Obama's leadership in science and technology and innovation. And number 70 on his list includes the Monarch Highway and his pollinator work. So we're still on the radar. We're now getting some funding. So I think there's some hope. And that's pretty much how change has happened, at least from the highway side of things. They're not just calling it a bunch of weeds anymore when they see a picture like that. That happens to be a county road in Minnesota that I often visit. But they're seeing that that diversity of flowers and grasses not only gives us natural beauty, beautification is still something they care about, but erosion control, water retention, a safe spot to land, obvious pollinator and wildlife habitat, including pheasants, and demonstrates that highways can do environmental stewardship, and in some places it doesn't cost them any money at all to do it. So thanks to that 2014 meeting in Mexico, we now have partners working together that are helping the Department of Transportation and other rights of ways, those of you gathered here, the Xerces Society, Monarch Watch, Make Way for Monarchs, the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, Wildlife Federation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and so many more. 50 states now have increased authority. They have access to more money. They just don't have new funding per se. And they have increased Department of Transportation champions who are popping up in the name of pollinator habitat. Is Diane from Ohio here? I looked around the room earlier. She's on the webinar. Okay, well, Diane, this is a shout out to you. I was at their transportation conference last year. The year before I got to help her put together a seed mix that would work for pollinators on a demonstration project that she has done and will be expanding. So hers is up and growing in a high visibility spot in Southwest Ohio. And it's champions like Diane that we need to find throughout the transportation system, and with public support we'll be able to do even more. So, not to leave the rest of the states in the room out of the picture, and I did not know what states would be here, so if I've left somebody out, you can just shout. States, first of all, the red states are states that are already doing reduced mowing, whether they have a law to or not. Okay, states like Florida are actually doing some research on reduced mowing and butterfly collisions to be sure that we're not accidentally killing butterflies in the process of doing what we're doing. And the study that I helped fund back in 2001, I'm not sure, actually was one in Iowa that showed that where we planted native grasses and flowers, bees and butterflies used it just as much as a nearby natural area, and there was not an increased death rate among butterflies. So that was a big sigh of relief. It turns out that when critters are happy on one side of the road, why would they bother to cross the road? Okay. So Idaho has been planting natives for a very long time. Iowa, you'll notice I actually put this in black and white before I met all of you today, has led the Midwest in planting efforts. And they are now adding more milkweeds with the help of Monarch Watch. Maine, reduced mowing, native planting, Minnesota. They've added 5,000 acres of natives in the last 10 years, and they've added 4 different milkweed species to their highway mixes. They now have native highway mixes that match different parts of the state. Missouri has planted a a pollinator garden at the St. Louis Zoo under the name of the Missouri Department of Transportation, a little good public relations, but also a good public awareness tool to help educate the public. Because if the public doesn't support what we're doing, we won't be able to do more of it. Ohio, I just told you about Diane's project. Illinois, since 1992, they've been inventorying their remnants. Remember I said finding those remnants is the cheapest thing we can do other than reduced mowing. If that habitat already exists, we need to protect it. And in the past, when I talked to Illinois Department of Transportation, and someone can correct me, but back then they were planting 1,000 acres a year of prairie plantings. I hope they're still doing that. I'm not sure if funding still allows that. No, it doesn't. Sorry to hear that. Hopefully we'll get back to that again, because that was astonishing to me. And Indiana has reduced mowing and has been doing native plantings. And I just found out recently they have 3 of their own seed farms, because seed supply isn't in great supply. They're planting their own and raising their own seed. Now, I don't encourage that, because I would prefer that commercial growers do it for us. I don't think the public public sector should be having nurseries and seed farms of their own, but that exemplifies a problem that we have in terms of seed supply. Wisconsin, I wanted to point out, has been working for years to protect the Karner blue butterfly, and it's because they have partnered with 22 groups in the part of the state where the Karner exists, and they immediately reduced mowing as the first thing to help the Karner butterfly, and then started planting lupins, which are the host plant for the Karner butterfly. So these kinds of efforts are out there, they're happening, and they are doable. So you think you've got problems now? Believe me, folks, we have more problems ahead of us when it comes to vegetation management. It's not going to get easier, it's going to be more complex, because invasive species are moving around the country and there are new ones all of the time. If we just could deal with the ones we already have, we would have more work to do than anybody's lifetime in this room. With the climate changing, you are pretty cognizant already of the increased storms and rainfalls that we're experiencing, parts of the country in drought, and of course this summer wildfires are setting new limits, new highs. I wish it were wildflowers. Wildfires are one of those threats to what we all do. So, to me, the only answer is partnerships, and I hope that's something that comes out of this meeting, that you see there is room for partnerships. I wanted to tell you about a number of partnerships. I limited myself to one. Do I still have time to tell about? Good. Okay. This is what is called the Greater Yellowstone area. It has at its core Yellowstone Park and Teton National Park. It covers the corners of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Did you know Yellowstone was that big? I was surprised when I first found out. And within that dark green area of Yellowstone, there are not only the 2 national parks I mentioned, but 6 national forests, 2 Fish and Wildlife Service refuges, 3 BLM lands, a lot of counties, I don't know how many, and 3 departments of transportation. And guess what, folks? They all work together. They have been working together for decades. And they do so as a cooperative weed management area. They have one large plan. They all contribute different pieces to the puzzle, but they work together. This is the most incredible partnership in the country when it comes to vegetation management, and you should pay attention to it. It shows that it is doable. There are a lot of other partnerships. I'm sorry I don't have time to tell you about those, but what I'm suggesting is that we need to think about rights-of-way partnerships too, because none of us have enough funds. The public support exists like it has never existed before. We need to take advantage of this opportunity, and by golly, pollinators need us too. So I added this quote from Gifford Pinchot, who was with the Forest Service back in 1947. Conservation is the application of common sense to the common problem for the common good. Well, I think that applies here and now with pollinators and rights of ways. So good luck to all of you. We have time for just a few questions if you have any. Or did I say everything so clearly you just, I've stunned you all. A question? How do you help address that problem with job loss? Good question, thank you. How do we address the issue of job loss if we reduce mowing? I'm sorry, there's not a Department of Transportation in this country that if they stop mowing would have to lay off anybody. There is so many other things that they can be doing. I've heard that argument many times, but believe me, it's one of the silliest arguments there is. Okay. There was a question right here.
Just wondering if any effort has been made to include the farming community, especially where there's CRP, to have them do contract growing for seeds and that sort of thing.
Has there been any effort to work with farmers, with CRP land especially, and to see if they would perhaps help grow some of the seed we need? I like that idea. We tried to find all kinds of people across the country who would be willing to grow the seed, and that was not something I could ever focus on completely, but we actually held a conference in Florida and asked the existing growers to come and tell how they did it to any potential new growers. And the people that grow native seed in this country are willing to share information. It's not like this is insider information. And we had people from around the country come. How many new growers turned out as a result, I don't know. But there's got to be a way to do that. I just simply haven't been able to find it. Because I know farmers, there are farmers that would help. Sure. This is a question that I don't have an answer for. Is there any effort to train lawn services about these kinds of alternative lawns and natural areas? No, I mean land managers that are in charge of natural areas get that kind of training, but when it comes to commercial groups, I've not heard of it.
Seminars that will be devoted to that. Obviously, you're only instructing the people that show up.
Right.
And, it's just a constant rush.
So the Illinois Contractors Group does have that kind of training, but as she said, it only educates the people who show up. So it's good to hear that. Keep that going.
There's actually one that's going to be next week out in Virgil, Illinois, at Midwest Trading, and that is that Jim Kleinwalker from the Conservation Foundation will be addressing the pollinators at that conference.
So there's one next week in Virgil. If you need more information, please talk to Maggie at the front table. Good. I mean, I would expect great things from conservation efforts from Illinois, from the people I've met over time. That's good to hear. There's a question behind you first. I'll come back to you. Okay.
famous in our town. Anyway, what I was wondering, and I know there are several IDOT employees who know on a national scale, is there, after moving forward, and there's not, why not, what do we do about it, to provide better education to our DOT employees throughout Illinois?
So is there information sharing going on with all the states in terms of vegetation management? There is a group called the National Roadside Vegetation Management Association. They have always focused on herbicides. I think that's fair. Occasionally they have some information, and it's an annual conference, so it's usually expensive to go to. That's one way people have gotten that information. But that book I mentioned to you that is now online was, I wrote it specifically so that every state could use it in their annual trainings, because every state DOT has a training session. It's usually a number of days. It used to be about herbicide applications, but these days it's about more than just that. So that book actually has classroom information and exercises and everything. So hopefully more departments of transportation are adding that piece of it that will certainly benefit pollinators. The name of the book is Vegetation Management and Eco-Regional Approach. If you Google it, you should find it easily. Hopefully I organized it simply and straightforwardly enough so any Department of Transportation will find what they need in it. But that book includes the regulations I described, so they know what support they do have in terms of the government. It has all kinds of telephone numbers from each state's experts that can help each state Department of Transportation do more. So it's called Vegetation Management and Eco-Regional Approach. And no, I make no money from it. I was in a public servant far too long. Any other questions?
Let's take one more question and we have one on the left.
Okay.
I just wanted to point out an answer. I'm Stephanie Dawson with the Illinois Department of Transportation on the roadside management side of few of us here today. And we have our design environment people here. We have our facilities from them too, so we do care. And we are trying. In the state of Illinois, we're district operated and funded by our central office down to the districts. So get that information out can be challenging sometimes. All of the roadside managers, landscape architects in those districts absolutely care, and they're on board. We are trying. Some of the districts way down south don't have a roadside manager. They just posted one job down there, so they're trying. We have had vacancies. You may be aware that we've had some budget issues in the state of Illinois, so that's challenged us. We're very small voice, and you all know we mow. You know, that's what we do, we mow. By the budget issues and some other things that have happened within the state of Illinois, not just this past year, but over the last several years, we have reduced our mowing significantly. And we meet somewhat regularly, but we are meeting, and we will be at the summit. We're meeting prior to that, so we care. And there is a person in each of your districts that is the champion for the roadside manager. They also have a million other things that they're responsible for, and they can't treat every little bit of teasel, but we're trying. We have some funding that's been 3 years, I think now, that's dedicated just for weed spraying. I know you guys know weed spraying. Well, we have to kill the invasives somehow, or the prairies aren't going to live. But we do, may not seem like it, but we do try to target just those invasives. Anyway, we're here, Sue Wade, Design Environment Jim Wade, and right here, Kimberly. So we're your DOT people that are here. I've been here with this group since the beginning. So just to find us.
Thank you. That's really encouraging. And these are the people who bothered to show up at this meeting that are the champions for Illinois' Department of Transportation. You just need to find them in every other state. They do exist. And they'll work hard for you because they care too. This is their state. This is their environment as well. Good luck, Illinois.
I'll just add one sentence to that. Your voice does matter. I had a prairie that was planted and constantly being mowed by the adjacent farmers. 2 letters from the public saying, will you please sign this route that is prairie to stop mowing, is all I needed for my boss to say, go do it this week, get it signed. So your voice does matter.
Thank you for that. I think a lot of times people forget, they think of departments of transportation as just, you know, one of those agencies that will roll over us. That's 1950s thinking. That's not true anymore. They do listen to the public. And if one letter ends up on the Secretary of Transportation or Commissioner, I'm not sure what it's called here, in Secretary of Transportation in Illinois, believe me, you'll get an answer. And if anybody can do anything about it, they'll get it done. Thank you.
There's a couple of questions on mine. The first one's in regard to controlled burns. Which is asking, is the need to conduct controlled burns as a best management tool no longer the issue it was in the past?
Question from online. Is the issue of controlled burns no longer the issue it was of the past? It varies from state to state in my experience. Some states are doing it, they're doing it safely, they're doing it smartly, they're doing it in a time, being able to time them so they're doing as little harm to anything as possible. But not all states have bought into it yet. They still think it's a safety issue. Any one of you in this room and I could go out this afternoon and burn a mile of roadside, checking to see if it was windy out or not, and have no problem. It's a matter of training the vegetation managers who do it, and if they've got the right training, often in states departments of natural resources will help in that kind of training. It's very doable, more doable than ever before. It still needs to increase, especially in prairie country. Final question?
Move on.
One last question. Are there any DOT roadside wild seed collections happening? How do you feel about using existing habitat as seed banks?
Are there any existing roadside collections of seed from Department of Transportation rights away? And the last piece.
How do you feel about using existing habitat as seed?
And how do I feel about using existing habitats as seed banks? First of all, there have been state departments of transportation that have been collecting their own seed for decades. In my own state, the Department of Natural Resources has been collecting seed from the highway rights-of-ways to plant in their wildlife management areas. Again, another kind of partnership that can happen between DOT and DNR. How do I feel about collecting? Oh, and while I was putting out research proposals, I put one out to actually come up with an affordable, again, I always was looking for things that departments of transportation could afford, their own seed harvesting machine. And it was innovated by a company in Texas. I don't know how widely it is used, but such a harvester does exist that will work on roadsides. You know, not all roadsides are straight and level or steep. Some of them have interesting bumps and lumps, but it is doable, and we certainly tried to find an answer for that. How do what do I think about collecting from natural areas? That has to be done really, really with careful planning. It has been done in different states. For example, many states have what are called scientific and natural areas, or natural areas that the state protects. You can harvest with the permission of the Conservation or Natural Resource Department, limited harvest and in only some places, but that is not a priority source of seed. It's doable, but it's very difficult to get that seed. So you can see the seed issue is a big piece of this puzzle. Okay?
Thank you.